Imagine a frozen desert, where the silence is broken only by the biting wind whispering ancient secrets. This desolate Alaskan landscape hid an indescribable horror for years. Amidst the vast white expanse, bodies were found, victims of a cruel predator. However, one young woman defied all odds, escaping and revealing the true face of evil to the world. On a cold autumn morning, two experienced hunters were exploring the vast and desolate landscapes of Alaska. The men, accustomed to the hardships of nature, were alert while hunting when, suddenly, something in the snow caught their eye. Approaching cautiously, they noticed the figure of a woman partially covered by snow. The shock was immediate. The victim, later identified as Sherry Monroe, had 223 caliber gunshot wounds. What made the scene even more disturbing was that her clothes had no bullet holes, indicating that she had been stripped before being shot and then dressed again. The horror of that discovery was undeniable, and the hunters, used to the hardships of nature, were deeply shaken. Sherry Monroe was a young woman involved in Anchorage's nightlife. On the night she disappeared, she had accepted an offer from a man who introduced himself as a photographer. He wanted to take pictures of her, promising good pay. Sherry, unsuspecting, accepted the proposal and got into the man's car. What she didn't know was that this encounter would be her last. The hunters, still in shock, quickly moved away from the body and headed to the nearest point where they could get a signal for their phones. With trembling hands, one of them dialed the emergency number, reporting the grim discovery. The police were immediately alerted, and soon, the authorities arrived at the scene. Investigators quickly cordoned off the area, starting a thorough examination of the crime scene. The discovery of Sherry Monroe became a crucial point in the investigation into a series of disappearances and murders of women in the region. Authorities realized they were dealing with a meticulous predator, someone who knew Alaska's unforgiving geography well and used it to hide his atrocities. The disturbing details of how Sherry was stripped and then dressed again provided a chilling insight into the criminal's mind. This was not an impulsive crime, but rather a planned and methodical act. The man's favorite weapon, a .223 caliber rifle, left an unmistakable signature at the crime scenes. The police, desperate for new leads, turned to the media for public help. In a press conference, a spokesperson asked anyone with information to come forward. The response was immediate and shocking. During the conference, a reporter revealed that two more bodies had been found in the same region. One of the victims was in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification difficult. The other was identified as Joanne Messina. Joanne Messina, like Sherry Monroe, had disappeared without a trace. Her body was found in a gravel pit, and the evidence suggested she had also been a victim of the same predator. The discovery of more bodies in the same area heightened the urgency of the investigation. Joanne Messina was a free-spirited woman, known by her friends for her joy and energy. Her disappearance deeply shook the community. On the night of her death, Joanne was returning home after a night of work when she was approached by a man who offered her a ride. She accepted the offer, not knowing she was getting into the car of a predator. Joanne's discovery was a hard blow for investigators who now saw a clear pattern emerging but still faced internal skepticism. Some firmly believed that all the cases were connected, forming a clear pattern of a meticulous serial killer. Others, however, remained skeptical, considering each case an isolated incident. This division in approach further complicated efforts to find the culprit. Meanwhile, public pressure was mounting. Families of the victims demanded answers and justice. The media continued to cover the developments of the cases intensely, feeding an atmosphere of fear and urgency. With each new body found, the community became more entangled in the dark mystery that loomed over Alaska. With the help of information from the public and collected clues, the police struggled to piece together a complex puzzle. With each lead followed, new questions arose. The predator was still at large, and the shadow of his crimes continued to cast a veil of terror over Anchorage. The community, united by fear and determination, awaited anxiously for a breakthrough that could finally bring peace and justice to the victims and their families. The victim who escaped. It was a cold night in June 1983 in Anchorage, Alaska. Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old girl, was on the street, trying to make a living as she did on so many other nights. Little did she know that her fate was about to intertwine with one of the most infamous criminals in American history. Robert Hansen, a respected baker in town, approached her in his car. He seemed like an ordinary, respectable man, offering her $200 for her services. Cindy, suspecting nothing, got into the car. As soon as the door closed, the atmosphere changed drastically. Hansen's apparent calm turned into a calculated coldness. He pointed a gun at her, and terror took hold of Cindy. Every heartbeat resonated in her ears as he tied her up and took her to his house. During the journey, she frantically observed every detail of the car, trying to memorize something that could help her escape or identify her captor later. Upon arriving at Hansen's modest house, the tranquil facade gave no hint of the horrors about to unfold. He dragged her to the basement, a claustrophobic place with concrete walls that seemed to close in around her. Hansen chained Cindy by the neck to a post, leaving her virtually immobile. The environment was oppressive. The dim light, the smell of dampness, and the feeling of total isolation contributed to her growing despair. While Hansen repeatedly tortured her, Cindy tried to focus her mind on things that gave her hope. She thought of her family, her friends, anything that could distract her from the immediate horror. The basement was a place of physical and psychological torment. The blocked windows prevented any glimpse of the outside world, and every sound she heard, the dripping water, Hansen's footsteps, heightened her anxiety. Hansen slept for a few hours on a nearby couch, a restless sleep that offered Cindy a small window of hope. Chained, she studied every detail of the basement, seeking an escape route. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and determination. She knew her only chance of survival was to escape, and every moment was crucial. After a period of unimaginable suffering, Hansen woke up with a clear plan. He would take her to his hideout in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, where he intended she would never be found. He made her get back into his car, her hands still cuffed, and drove to Merrill Field Airstrip, where his small private plane was parked. The noise of the engine and the cold morning wind created an environment of chaos and fear. Cindy, though terrified, saw an opportunity to escape. While Hansen was distracted with the flight preparations, she bravely crawled to the front seat of the car. Her eyes frantically scanned the interior of the vehicle, desperately searching for the door handle. With a burst of adrenaline, she managed to open the door and ran with all her might, barefoot and handcuffed. Every step was a mix of pain and hope. The cold, hard asphalt hurt her feet, but the fear of being recaptured pushed her forward. Cindy's heart pounded frenetically, each beat resounding like a war drum in her ears. The early morning was almost deserted, and she felt like the only living person in a frozen world. In despair, Cindy saw a car approaching. With her injured feet and handcuffed hands, she frantically waved, begging for help. The driver of the car, Robert Yunt, saw her condition and stopped immediately. The sight of a terrified, handcuffed young woman was enough for him to understand the gravity of the situation. He helped her into the car and took her to a safe place, a nearby motel. At the motel, Cindy ran to the lobby, still in shock, and begged the attendant to call her boyfriend. The attendant, realizing the desperation and gravity of the situation, promptly made the call. Meanwhile, Yunt, realizing the seriousness of the situation, contacted the Anchorage police. Officers quickly arrived at the motel and found Cindy, still handcuffed and visibly traumatized. She was taken to the police station, where she gave a detailed account of her abduction. Cindy described Hansen, his car, and the plane with impressive precision, providing the police with the necessary clues to identify her aggressor. Cindy insisted that the police go to the hangar to check the plane. They followed her lead, but upon arrival, Robert Hansen had already left. However, an employee at the site provided the police with the plane's registration and a description of the car Hansen had left in. This clue led to the identification of Robert Hansen as the suspect. Despite the compelling evidence provided by Cindy, the police initially doubted the veracity of her story. Prejudice against Cindy, being a young woman involved in prostitution, contributed to the investigators' skepticism. The police decided to search Hansen's house, but despite his cooperation, they found no direct evidence linking him to the crimes at that time. Hansen claimed to have an alibi, providing the names of two friends who could confirm his story. He stated that he had been with John Henning and John Sumrall during the night of Cindy's abduction, splitting time between Henning's house and a plane seat repair project with Sumrall. The officers called John Henning, who initially confirmed that Hansen was at his house. With this, the police temporarily believed Cindy had fabricated her story. Without sufficient evidence, the officers left Hansen's house and the case went cold. For 3 months, the investigation into Robert Hansen made no progress. Cindy Paulson's case was almost forgotten by the police, who were involved in other cases and daily routines. However, on September 2, 1983, a shocking new discovery brought the case back into focus. A group of construction workers was working in a rural area of Alaska, performing routine road repairs. While digging and removing layers of earth and snow, one of the workers found something unexpected. Initially, it seemed to be just a mound of darker snow, but as they approached, an unmistakable smell of decomposition hit their noses. With their hearts racing, the workers began to dig with more determination. With each shovel of earth removed, the truth was revealed. Gradually, a body emerged in an advanced state of decomposition. The victim was identified as Paula Goulding, a young woman who had disappeared a few months earlier. Next to the body, investigators found a .223 caliber shell casing. The discovery of Paula Goulding, along with the shell casing, brought a new sense of urgency to the investigation. Analyzing the shell casings found at different crime scenes, investigators realized that they all came from the same weapon, reinforcing the theory that a serial killer was operating in the region. These new pieces of evidence revitalized the investigation into Robert Hansen. The connection between the cases of Cindy Paulson, Sherry Monroe, Joanne Messina, and Paula Goulding became undeniable. With the new clues in hand, the police intensified their efforts to capture the predator terrorizing Anchorage and bring justice to the victims and their families. Investigation. The collaboration between the local police and the FBI was crucial in re-evaluating the evidence and changing the attitude towards Cindy Paulson's case. The FBI's experience and methodological approach brought a new seriousness to an investigation previously marked by hesitation and skepticism. Guided by detailed profiles provided by John Douglas and his team, local investigators began to reassess all available evidence from a new perspective. John Douglas, a renowned FBI profiler, developed a psychological profile of the criminal describing a man with low self-esteem, deeply resentful of the rejections he had faced, especially from women. He was a meticulous individual with specialized knowledge in hunting and familiarity with Alaska's isolated geography. Based on this profile and the information provided by Cindy, the police began to connect the dots. They cross-referenced witness statements and flight records from Hansen's plane, which coincided with the victim's disappearances. The combination of testimonial and physical evidence allowed the investigators to build a solid case against Hansen. However, the turning point in the case occurred when John Henning, initially cited as Hansen's alibi, admitted to lying. When confronted by the police, Henning had stated that Hansen was at his house during Cindy's abduction, but the truth soon emerged. Henning's wife, Joanne Henning, revealed to the officers that her husband was lying. She explained that he thought he was covering up an insignificant lie, unaware that he was protecting a serial killer. On October 27, 1983, a team of investigators, armed with a search warrant, went to Robert Hansen's residence to carry out the operation. The scene at Hansen's house was tense. The police surrounded the property, ensuring he had no way to escape. They knocked on the door, and when Hansen opened it, he was immediately detained. The officers entered the house carefully, knowing that any mistake could compromise the investigation. Inside the house, the team began a meticulous search for evidence. In the basement, they found a vast collection of weapons, including rifles that would later be confirmed as the murder weapons through ballistic analysis. Each weapon was carefully catalogued and removed for analysis. Forensic analysis played a crucial role in the investigation. The forensic procedures of the time included fiber collection and analysis, ballistic comparisons, and fingerprint identification. Ballistic analysis revealed that the bullets recovered from the victims' bodies matched the rifles found in Hansen's house. This ballistic link was one of the key elements that directly connected Hansen to the murders. Additionally, jewelry was found in Hansen's house and was carefully catalogued and compared with items reported missing by the victims' families. This meticulous process of identifying the jewelry helped confirm that Hansen had direct access to the victims' belongings, further reinforcing the connection between him and the disappearances. An aerial map was also found in Hansen's house, with small X's marked at specific locations. Each X on the map was cross-referenced with the records of disappearances and locations where bodies were found. This analysis revealed a pattern of movement and location that coincided with Hansen's hunting spots. The precision of the markings on the map indicated an intimate knowledge of the terrain and a detailed premeditation of the crimes. The collaboration between the local police and the FBI also included the creation of a special task force dedicated exclusively to capturing Hansen. Federal agents brought additional resources and advanced investigative techniques that were crucial in connecting the pieces of the puzzle. The task force worked tirelessly to build a strong case against Hansen, revisiting all the evidence and using detailed criminal profiles. With the accumulated evidence and the growing pressure to solve the case, the investigators decided to summon Robert Hansen for interrogation. The amount of circumstantial and physical evidence, combined with Cindy Paulson's detailed description and the psychological profiles developed, provided a solid foundation to confront Hansen directly. Robert Hansen's confession. With the mounting evidence and increasing pressure from the police and FBI, Robert Hansen was finally brought in for interrogation. Initially, Hansen tried to maintain his facade of innocence. During the early sessions, he categorically denied any involvement in the crimes. The calmness he displayed while answering questions suggested an unfounded confidence in his ability to evade the charges. Armed with compelling evidence, the investigators employed a sophisticated psychological strategy to break Hansen's resistance. They confronted him with the victim's jewelry found in his house, the rifles whose bullets matched those recovered from the bodies, and, crucially, the aerial map marked with X's at specific locations. Hansen remained calm, offering evasive explanations and trying to downplay the severity of the evidence. If you find this story as fascinating as it is disturbing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. Your subscription helps us bring more intriguing content like this. And now, let's uncover how Hansen finally confessed to his horrific crimes. Prosecutors offered Hansen a deal. He would only be sentenced for the murders of 4 women if he revealed the locations of the bodies of the other victims. Realizing this was his best option, Hansen accepted the deal and provided details about where he had buried or left the bodies of his other victims. Finally, on February 22, 1984, after exhaustive hours of interrogation, Hansen began to confess his crimes. He chillingly described how he selected his victims, usually women involved in Anchorage's nightlife. He recounted that if they cooperated, he would take advantage of them and then let them go. However, if they resisted, he would take them to remote areas of Alaska where he would release and hunt them like animals. His voice, devoid of emotion, revealed the full extent of his brutality. Hansen's defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof that Hansen had committed the murders. However, the amount and nature of the evidence were undeniable. Emotional testimonies from the victims' families and the presentation of the murdered women's stories painted a grim picture of the impact of Hansen's crimes. The media intensely covered the trial, with each new development broadcast to a public eager for justice. Public reactions were of shock and horror as the details of Hansen's atrocities came to light. The trial was a moment of catharsis for the Anchorage community, seeking understanding and closure after years of fear and uncertainty. Robert Hansen's confession marked the culmination of an exhaustive investigation and a trial that captured the nation's attention. In his own words, Hansen detailed the horror of his acts. He admitted to taking the lives of at least 17 women and physically assaulting dozens of others. Hansen explained how he chose his victims and the methods he used to subjugate and eventually kill them. His confession included horrific descriptions of how he hunted his victims in Alaska's remote areas, turning their final hours into a macabre game of survival. The coldness with which Hansen recounted these events shocked those present. He admitted to keeping trophies from his victims, such as jewelry and other personal belongings, which served as mementos of his heinous acts. Hansen's confession, recorded in a series of interviews, revealed the full extent of his brutality and his lack of remorse. With Hansen's confession and the compelling evidence presented, the trial proceeded relatively quickly. In February 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He was initially sent to Spring Creek State Penitentiary in Alaska and later transferred to Seward State Penitentiary for his own safety due to the notoriety of his crimes. The sentence ensured that Hansen would never leave prison, bringing some sense of justice to the victims' families. The capture and conviction of Robert Hansen marked the end of an era of terror in Alaska. His confession and subsequent death in prison on August 21, 2014, brought some closure to the victims' families, but the scars left by his crimes remain. Hansen's story is not just a chronicle of heinous crimes, but also a testament to the resilience and courage needed to face and overcome such horrors. The Hansen case continues to be studied and remembered as an example of how justice can prevail, even in the face of the deepest evil.